Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming down here to this. And this is, we've been doing this for very many years at Centennial College. Just before we start, I would like to recognize, hiding in the back, Mr. Ted Bilas, who's a 17-time best-selling author. And Ted has run this from the very beginning. And Ted retired from our school at the end of last semester in the spring. And Ellin and I will be taking over from him now for the years to come. So please recognize Ted Bilas. He's not normally that shy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome from Centennial College the author of the new book, Double Threat, Canadian Jews, the Military in World War II. Please welcome Ms. Ellin Bessner.
Would you please stand for the singing of our national anthem? Sergeant at Arms, march on the colors.
Please join me in the singing of our national anthem. O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love, in all thy sons command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true north, strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Well, thank you, everyone. May be seated. I almost forgot to let you sit down. I feel like the rabbi in synagogue. Welcome to the Royal Canadian Legion Todmorden Branch number 10. I want to thank P.J. O'Neill, the president. Thank you to your Sergeant at Arms, Paul Scully, to the members of the Color Guard, Branch 10, and to the president of our Royal Canadian Legion Wingate Branch 256, Shelley Rosen, and to the veterans who are here, to Centennial College Story Arts Center Dean Nate Horowitz, and Executive Cantor Gordon Lindsay from Shari Tafila, who you'll be hearing about in a little bit, Daniel Barak from University of Toronto's music program, our trumpeter, to all the veterans, neighbors, friends, and Malcolm, again, thank you for helping us put this together. We're trying, Ted. It's not as big footsteps to fill, so be gentle with us. I want to welcome you all on this horrible, blustery winter day. Don't feel bad. Feel bad for Daniel. Tomorrow, Daniel is doing the cenotaph for the Toronto City Hall outside trumpeter artillery. There's minus 17 tomorrow, wind chill. So when he came to my house this morning, and I said, "You're going like that with no coat?" So tomorrow, please dress warm and don't freeze up. I want to thank you all for having us today in this beautiful hall. And I know that despite the weather and other things that have prevented us from having a larger ceremony somewhere else, we won't mention what that is, but it starts with an S. I know you're all doing this to honor the veterans, and that's why we're all here. And I thank you all for coming today. The students who came when Ted was organizing it at Centennial with Steve Cogan came because they had to do it for marks at first. But then the event became more than just an assignment. It allowed the students to witness, experience firsthand the stories, the experiences of veterans, first responders, and really get to know them on a first-person basis. And we are grateful that we're allowed to try to continue this tradition. And it's a good thing we're in your capable hands, Paul Scully, because tomorrow night, or is it tonight, you're at the Air Canada Centre for the Leafs-Bruins game doing the color guard. So you've helped us put this together, and we thank you. Now, tomorrow is the big Remembrance Day televised from Parliament Hill. And as you know, Malcolm may have mentioned, because tomorrow is the Sabbath, Jewish Sabbath, there were restrictions. You can't carry, you can't use electronics. And so the normal place where the Jewish veterans would have their ceremony, which was the Miles Nadal Jewish Community Center outside, so we're actually better off here, let's think for next year, was not possible. And so despite the situation, Malcolm made a quick phone call, and you graciously hosted us, including the food. Remembrance Day always comes in the same week as a very important day on the Jewish calendar, which is November 9th, it was just last night, which was Kristallnacht, which was the night of the broken glass. Now, I don't know how you're going to see. I have some slides. Let's hope they see. I'm going to use them anyway, but if not, it'll be a backdrop. I'll send it to you on email. It's a solemn week for Jews all across the world because it's Holocaust Education Week in Toronto, and we recognize the night when, in 1938, Hitler sent his Nazi goons to destroy the beginning of the final solution in the Second World War, where they destroyed synagogues, Jewish businesses, deported 30,000 Jewish men from Austria and Germany to death camps, and it began the ramping up of the murder of 6 million Jews. And we know a lot about the Holocaust. What's less well known is about the 17,000 Canadian Jewish servicemen and women who put on a uniform and went over as the victors, as the liberators, to stop the Holocaust. Sadly, they were too late in most cases. But that story has never been told. And thank you, Malcolm, for the shout out for my new book, Double Threat. I have cards if anybody would like to see later. Because it's very not known that among the 1 million+ Canadians who put on a uniform for Canada during World War II, 10% of their population, there were 10% of the Canadian Jewish population at the time. There was 168,000 Canadian Jews in Canada at the time, and more than 10% served because we know that at least 16,800 went, because they actually, poor things, had to count with little secretarial stations typing out the names of all the boys and girls who, and I've seen those papers, that poor secretary. They didn't have faxes in those days. And I had 9 members in my own family who served in uniform in World War II, including one of the 450 who was killed. Jack Brovender was from Timmins. He was my grandfather's brother-in-law, and he was studying business at McGill, and he enlisted, and he was killed on their first training flight over the York Fells, the Downs of the Lake District in England, near Keswick, on their first overnight training flight, and smashed into one of the fells, and he's buried in England. But I never knew anything about him. No one ever talked about him. No one ever talked about it. And yet, the war experiences of the Canadian Jewish servicemen were pretty much similar to the experiences of non-Jewish veterans. They had to leave home, they had to get a haircut, they had to learn about military life, they were lonely, they had to ship out far away from home, many of them. They had to eat strange food, they suffered fear, they suffered injury, many of them died. And they went for similar reasons, Jew or non-Jew. They went because it was the Depression. You could earn $1.30 a day if you were a rank private in the army. Women earned 70 cents. And that was the way it was. And you could get a steady job, or you could leave your small town or your big city and not work in your parents' business and have a little adventure. They didn't think the war would last for 6 years. Or your friends were going, so it was peer pressure. Or it was for king and country. Those reasons were all the same. Or because their buddies were going, so they went. Or because their brothers had signed up and the women went, or they wanted to go themselves. But for the Canadian Jewish community, serving in the Second World War was a double threat, a double burden. And that's why I called my book that name. Because not only were they going to save the world from for freedom, democracy, human rights, social justice, but they were also going to save their own people from annihilation. And there was the danger that if they were caught, shot down, or captured, their fate would be very dark indeed as Jews, especially if it's on their dog tags, or their name was Izzy Cohen, as a lot of them were named that way. So they went anyway. And so the reason that I called my book Double Threat is because of this fellow, Prime Minister Mackenzie King, who was Prime Minister at the time. Now, he's not a favorite person in the Jewish community for many reasons, including one which Prime Minister Trudeau, I think, is working on an apology for turning away 900 Jews on a boat, the SS St. Louis, in 1939, just before the war broke out, and not allowing them to dock. The US and Cuba did not either. They've already apologized. Canada has never apologized. Of the 900 people who were on that boat, 700 were killed in the Holocaust, 200 survived. There's supposed to be an apology. I assume we'll have it in May when it's the anniversary. So we don't like him to begin with. But why I was so upset about, and I called my book Double Threat, is because of this. In 1947, it's hard to see, he wrote a letter after the war thanking Canada's Jewish community for contributing to the Allied war victory and defeating Hitler. And he said, for you, the war is a double threat. But I thought, you know, first of all, you didn't let us in. Even before the war, there were no lack of examples of how Canada was not a welcoming country for Canada's Jews. There were quotas at university programs. You couldn't go to medical school. You couldn't get an accounting designation because no firms would hire you, and you needed that to be your apprenticeship. You couldn't get rent. Some places in Toronto, Centre Island, and in the country, cottage country, as well as across Canada, wouldn't have Jews allowed, no Jews allowed. There were riots, Christie Pitts in 1933, when swastika clubs and the Balmy Beach Club and others on that area, Q Beach, wouldn't allow Jewish bathers. There were riots. So it was not a friendly place. And I said, first, you don't let us in as refugees, because none is too many. 1939, Canada's refugee system was closed to Jews. Then 17,000 of our brothers and sisters put on a uniform for Canada. 450 die. 6 million Jews are murdered. And now you thank us. So I said that is such chutzpah that I had to put it as the title of my book. Chutzpah is when you kill your parents and you're an orphan and you go to ask for leniency from the judge for being an orphan. That's chutzpah. So Canada's Jews had a unique experience in the Second World War. And not just because they were immigrants, they lived in the Kensington Market area. They had, as I said, the Christie Pitts riots. They also couldn't get into some of the services because the Air Force wasn't taking Jews, especially at the beginning, as officers. You had to be British subjects. Most of the people who lived in Canada were immigrants from Eastern Europe. They weren't naturalized yet at that time, so you had to have a British passport, British subject. They also wouldn't take Jews in the Navy. Ben, I'll tell you in a minute a story about that. And it was tough to get in. Some regiments, even in Toronto, were not accepting Jews. People had to go to Hamilton. They had to go elsewhere to get enlisted when the war broke out, because that was how it was. It was a very, very British, very, very Anglo, very, very Protestant society, and there were no room for Jews. Also, it was thought that if there was Jewish officers, that the crews or the men would not follow them in a pinch, especially in a cockpit situation, because the pilots had to all be white and they had to be British subjects. But we did have, despite all that, the Jewish men and women rushed to the armories when the war broke out in 1939. East York Angle, on Jones and Gerard, Esther Bubis and her brother Meyer Bubis served in the military. They grew up at the corner, children of dressmakers, and Esther's brother Meyer served in Dieppe, and he was killed in Dieppe. They didn't find his body till November. It washed up on the shore in November, although Dieppe was August 1942. However, Esther, when she turned 18, said, I'm the only woman left I'm going to go in my family. I'm going to go. The other brothers were rejected for medical reasons, so I'm enlisting, and she enlisted. It wasn't a thing, Jewish women, it was looked down on for women to serve. It was not considered dignified. There were worse words that they were called, which we won't mention here, but also starting with an S. And so she served so that she could take up her brother's torch, East York Angle. And she's still alive, and she's living in Trenton area. Ajax, I should say. All right, quiz, because we're all teachers or we're all in education. I'm going to show you some slides of some famous Canadian Jewish people who served. See if you can get them. And this is probably, if you're older, it'll help you. But I'll help you. We'll help each other with the answers. Ready? Can you see those guys? It's hard to see. All right. Malcolm for 10 points. Wayne and Frank Schuster served in the Army. They did enlist. They were famous Canadian comedians from Harvard Collegiate and on the CBC, and they went overseas and entertained the troops. I don't know if you can see. It's not Fonzie. So he was Arthur Hiller, director of Love Story, and he was a navigator. Love Story was a famous movie in this. Where do I begin? Okay. He died recently, actually. Ben Dunkelman. I'm going to just tell you because I'm getting long in the tooth here. Ben Dunkelman, Tip Top Tailors. You know where the loft is down on the lakeshore? So he was the son. He went to UCC. I say went. Didn't graduate. He was a partier. But his father owned the biggest men's retailer menswear retailer in Canada, and they had the contract to do all the uniforms for the Army. So when he wanted to enlist in the Navy and they wouldn't take him, his father said, who cares? We need you to run the business. He said, how can I be here in Canada when my brethren are dying? I'm going. And so he joined the Queen's Own Rifles, became a major. They used to call him Shoot a Million because he would shoot millions of 20 mortars instead of one. And he also became a war hero in the 1948 Israeli War of Independence. He saved the city of Nazareth's Arab residents from being deported. Oh, you won't be able to see this. All right, I'll just tell you. Barney Danson used to be Minister of National Defense. His father's family also founded Camp Winnebago. And on the right-hand side, you can't see, but it's Freddie Harris. So Freddie Harris was the first, he was a sergeant, and he was the first man out of the landing craft on Juno Beach, 8:15, with these Queen's Own Rifles, landing craft 8, and he was the first one killed. Didn't even make it to the shore, and they were best friends. You won't see this. David Steinberg, the comedian, his oldest brother, Jaime, was 17 and a half, and he was driving his father crazy. They're from Winnipeg. He said, I want to go in. And his father said, you're not going in, you're too young, and I'm not signing your papers for you to let you because you have to be 18. So Jaime's family lived in a 3-story building in Winnipeg, and Jaime said, I'm going to drive you crazy until you let me. And they had tenants on the 2nd floor. So what Jaime used to do, because I interviewed David Steinberg and he told me this, he used to walk up and down the stairs at night like this, so loud to drive his tenants crazy, and the father said, okay, 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 and he signed the papers. The mother wouldn't speak to them for 2.5 days before Jaime left, and Jaime's buried in Reykjavik, outside the city. If you ever go to Iceland and you see the airport and the Blue Lagoon and you drive into the city of Reykjavik, there's a war cemetery there. He was a wireless gunner, the wireless operator, air gunner, on a patrol vessel, a Canso, and they smashed into the mountain because the pilot took a shortcut, and Jaime was 19. This one you'll know, because he just died. Did I get it? Monty Hall. Monty Hall was young when the war broke out in Winnipeg. He was a science major. He wanted to go into med school, and they, of course, weren't taking Jews, very few in med school in Winnipeg. So he ended up being an entertainer in the reserves. And he wanted to join the tank corps, and he went to the COTC, which is like the reserves on campus when you're going to school. You can study and be in the military at the same time. And the officer said, oh, I don't think the Armored Corps is taking Jews. So it probably saved his life, but he wasn't allowed, and he stayed in school and entertained the troops and became a famous Hollywood let's make a deal showman at the end of the war. And he just died like 2 weeks ago. And he's in my book because I interviewed him. The last one is the mayor of Windsor, David Kroll, who you may probably know. He was Senator David Kroll. He was the first Jewish cabinet minister in Ontario, mayor of Windsor twice. The Essex Scottish were not allowing Jewish men to enlist. And they told the mayor, who was David Kroll at the time, so David Kroll, because he's savvy that way, he called the media and he said, Windsor Star, send a photographer. I'm going to meet you at the armories. And he marched down to the armories with the media there, and he enlisted as a rank private. And they had to take him, otherwise it would be embarrassing. And he served through the war, and the Essex Scottish colonel, who was known for, it was also his rival, had lost to Kroll in the election, made him clean latrines because he was anti-Semitic. Signing up as a Jew was problematic. You had to decide if you were going to put your religion down or not on the papers when you signed up, because it would go on your dog tags, it would go on your soldier's pay book that you had to carry with you even into battle. It also could determine where you would be allowed to serve. Some Jewish people did not choose to do that. They hid their identities. They joined up as other Protestants or Catholics or Church of England, or they just lied, said nothing. They said atheist. Because here's what would happen to you if they did find out you were Jewish. This is from an attestation paper for Alex Balanson, who was from Hamilton. So first of all, I've never seen it on non-Jewish forms. I've looked at hundreds of them. But as soon as they know you're Jewish, that's the first thing they write down is Hebrew. And then they talk about how great he was, that he graduated from high school, that he was smart, he was an athletic, super guy. But then they go, maybe a little rough due to the background, could be pushy, and that's what was on his forms. And he was in the Air Force and died overseas. So here's the grave of my cousin, Ashton Irving Cohen from Pembroke. I know they're Jewish. His brothers are Jewish. His parents were Jewish. He enlisted as Hebrew, but then he carried a Bible with him, a New Testament, and told everyone he was Presbyterian. And he's buried under a cross in the Reichswald Cemetery. I saw the grave this summer. And he was married, engaged, I should say, to a Jewish girl. But he decided for protection, and they got shot down. And he's still there under a cross. You may know Oscar Adler. He's a very long-time member of the Jewish veterans. He served as OD. Those are the forms that the Canadian government finally allowed Jewish people and others to say OD for other denomination after they realized everyone was lying. Now, not everybody took it. Harry Hurwitz, who was in the Navy, knocked out 2 of his officers' front teeth and punched him in the face after the officer said to him, "Oh, why did Hitler miss you?" on the HMCS Athabaskan, which was the largest casualty of a destroyer in the Second World War from the Canadian Navy. It was torpedoed off in the English Channel, and hundreds died, and everyone else was taken prisoner, including Harry. But I saw him 2 weeks ago in Montreal, and he's 96, and he said, "I'm still glad I did it." He got demoted, he got put in the brink. Nothing happened to the officer, because the officer told the judge or whatever that he was just joking. And now I'm going to stop, because there's so much more I can tell you, but you want to hear from our special guests. And we might go a little bit longer, a few minutes longer. So I would like to call up our 2 special guests, one who is here with us in the front row who served in Europe and Italy, and one whose uncle he is named after, because sadly he didn't come back. So I'd like you all to give a minute. We'll get the chairs set up for Mo Polansky and Gordon Lindsay. You guys can sit, how about side by side? I'll sit in the middle, and you can hold this, and I'll get the other mic too. Okay. So I'm going to start with Mr. Polansky, and just so you know, he's so popular that he's leaving here soon after today's ceremony, and you're going down to the Calvary Church at Pape and Danforth, and they're going to interview you there too, are they not, as a special guest? So actually, it's good that you came here because it's right down the street. But we get you first.
Would have been better if it had been at the Centennial. It'd been closer.
Yeah, that's right. We all hope to be there soon,
Yeah.
very soon. So Mo, thank you so much for being with us. Let's just tell everybody. Let's just get it out there. You were born in 1921. So do the math.
1921, so that, figure it out. It's 96.
Poo, 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 poo. That's amazing.
Plus.
And your family came to Canada and moved to Saskatchewan. Can you tell us a little bit about how that happened, where they lived and why they came?
Right. My paternal grandparents arrived in Canada about 1892. My father they came from Ukraine. And of course, there was a large Jewish population there. And of course, the living accommodations and the feelings towards the Jews wasn't the greatest. So there was always a great migration of Jews to the new America, which was either United States or Canada. So my father was only 2 years old, and they came over in 1892, and they arrived in Montreal, and my grandfather, for about a year and a half, went into the peddling business and sold some pots and pans. But really, the people that came from the Ukraine were, even if they were Jewish, they were more agriculturally oriented. So he came out west, and he landed out in Saskatchewan at around 1894, and he bought land out there and settled. My father, of course, was getting older and older, and eventually he was old enough to get married, and took my mother from Brandon, Manitoba, from a big metropolis of Manitoba, out to the boonies of Saskatchewan.
I couldn't even find it on the map. I made a Google map behind us. It's called Oxbow, 700 people, right?
Yeah, well,
If they were soaking wet.
715, and when I left, the population went down to 714.
And your family raised what kind of crops?
They grew wheat, oats, barley, flax, millet, chickens, cattle. You know, it was a mixed farming.
No pigs. No pigs.
No pigs. No.
Kosher
No.
farm. And how many Jewish families were there when you lived there?
During my time growing up, I would say there was about 5 Jewish families, and out of the 5 Jewish families, there were only 3 Jewish boys in the town of Oxbow, and they were my 2 brothers and myself.
And you did experience a bit of anti-Semitism from the kids at school, did you not?
No, not necessarily from the children. No, my peers, my children, I got along very well with them. It was the adults. The adults all had their fun, their enjoyment, all of that sort of thing. And
What was the joke they used to make you laugh at when they
yeah,
said?
the Lord said unto Moses, all the Jews shall have long noses.
And you had to laugh, otherwise,
Otherwise, you weren't one of them.
that's right.
Yeah. It was not easy growing up in the Bible Belt.
And when the war broke out, you were encouraged to finish your high school degree, even though, or diploma, even though you wanted to go. But when you eventually joined up, how old were you and what service did you go to?
Okay, yes, the war broke out in 1939, and I came back from Alberta from the harvest fields. I used to ride the rods, and the first thing I said, I was going to join up, and I went downtown one day, this big town of Oxbow, and I met two old veterans from World War I. And they said, well, what are you going to do, Morris, this and that? And I said, well, I'm going to join up. He says, where are you in school now? I says, well, I just finished my grade 11. Well, he says, why don't you finish school, take your grade 12? The both of them encouraged me to do that and join up a year later, and which I did, which I joined up in 1940.
And you went overseas, but before you went there, you were at Canadian Forces Borden training, were you not?
Yes, I was first stationed in Camp Shiloh, Manitoba, and then came down to Camp Borden, and then from Camp Borden, I went overseas, which was 1940.
And was it hard for your family because all of you enlisted, all three boys?
That's right. Yeah.
What did your mom say?
Well, she was heartbroken and couldn't do much about it. That's the way we were. We, especially in a ground town, in a small town, there was a certain amount of peer pressure and this and that. You sort of obligated to join up. It was not easy to stay back while all your friends had already joined up, and some of them had already gone overseas.
Let me ask you to skip ahead a little bit towards when you were shipped from Liverpool you were going to Italy, and you had to take the SS Santa Elena to get there, and it was a big troop ship with lots of nurses on them.
Yes, there was a
Beautiful.
yes,
A dream come true.
It was called the 14th General Hospital, so there were something like 1,800 to 2,000 troops on there, including this General Hospital of Nurses. We sailed from Liverpool north around Ireland through the Irish Sea, went away. Of course, at that time, the Germans still had possession of France, so you couldn't go south. So we went around France, went around Ireland, and out into the Atlantic, back into the Straits of Gibraltar, and went right through into the Mediterranean Sea. We sailed for about approximately 2 days, 2.5, I can't be too sure. And then I can remember the date, November the 6th, it was about 6:05 p.m. The German Luftwaffe came down off the coast of France, and they dropped, and we were in a large convoy. There were two troop ships.
I can't even, two
and
troop ships, that's hard
There
to
were
say.
corvettes and merchant marine and all of that, and Germans dropped their bombs. There were 2 torpedoes that hit our ship, and fortunately the ship did not go down immediately. I remember I volunteered to throw life rafts over, and that helped me gain my composure. And then eventually the nurses, 14th General Hospital, they all climbed down the
rigging.
scramble nets,
Yeah.
and they got into lifeboats. Fair enough, that's fair game. And we all went down the scramble nets, and we swam a little bit and got a life raft wherever there was and floated off away from the ship. And eventually it was some Americans came along in lifeboats and picked us all up. We were all floating in there, and it's getting dark. I was getting kind of concerned. There were a couple of things that I was concerned about. Anyway, they picked us up.
Just concerned? You were in the water for 4 hours.
Yes, but I'll tell you one of the things that I was concerned of. I don't know if there are any people here, maybe you all look pretty young here. There was a movie came out some years ago by Noel Coward, In Which We Serve. And I remember very good. And I remember when the ship was hit and they all had to float out, and the Germans came and they strafed them. And that was in the Mediterranean. And that went through my mind while I was floating in the water, that the Germans would come back and strafe us. But fortunately, it was starting to get dark, so there were no more airplanes coming down. So that was one of my concerns. My other concern was, are there sharks in here? There's crazy things that go through your mind.
You're from Oxbow. I would have thought the same thing. Sharks in the Mediterranean. Why not?
And then eventually we got picked up by another troop ship called the Monterey, and there also was about 2,000 troops on there. And then we made a run for a little place in North Africa called Phillipsville, and we stayed there for a couple of days. And in fact, it was the next day, there was our ship being towed in, and we're saying, hurrah, this is great. I'll be able to get all those cigarettes that I bought duty-free. I'll get them, all the chocolate bars and everything. And just as they got into the harbor of Phillipsville, I can remember the ship going up one way, coming down, and it sunk, and there was all my cigarettes and chocolate bars. So that was the end of the ship, and then we made a run for it to Naples. And from there, it was history in Italy. I went north to Caserta. We lost all our equipment. So we were held back for quite some time before we could get on regular duty. And then when we got re-equipped, we started moving north to northern Italy until we eventually left Italy to go to France, Belgium, and Holland.
And from that point, I'm going to segue over to Gordon, because his story also has to do with Africa, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. So thank you very much, Gordon. We're going to get you to work a little bit later up here singing, but I wanted to welcome you. And also, not everyone knows this, but Ted and you know each other a long time. Where did you meet?
Well, yeah, I actually knew Ted Barris when he had hair. And if you want, I can tell you where I buy mine. Ted and I were at Ryerson, learning radio and television arts. And we were buddies. We were co-producers of a radio program, and we had a lot of fun together. Remember the Earthworms? Yes, we were trying. At any rate, that's another story.
Another story.
Yes, that's.
You're here because of your uncle, the flying officer, Gordon Steinberg, who came from the Junction in Maria Street area. Can you tell us why you're named after him and a little bit about who he was?
Well, there are actually three of us.
Oh, right.
It's
There's
traditional.
three Gordons, yeah.
It's traditional in the Jewish religion that when a child is born, he's named after a deceased ancestor, and usually they try to go, cover as many bases as they can. But in the early 50s, the only recently deceased ancestor we all had in common was Gordon Steinberg.
You don't know if you can see, his photo is up here with his nose cone of his fighter plane that he had painted, which we'll talk about in a minute.
He was quite a character, and in fact, I was going to refer to that picture. We'll explain it a little later. It has a lot to do with what Ellin was talking about when people were designated as Hebrew, and it caused problems. Well, he had a different take on that.
Not at the beginning, though. You said he was a bit of a rebel. The family was very, very Jewish, but he kind of strayed a little bit, right?
Well,
at the beginning.
He had an independent mind. As I was going to say, we were all named after him because he was the eldest son of Abraham and Bilas Steinberg, and all of us came from their children. And what he was made clear to me as a very big man, a legend in terms of his personality, in terms of his proclivities, in terms of his bravery. See, I grew up at Dufferin and Wilson. Dufferin and Wilson was pretty much a farm area when I was around there. And in fact, my uncle, who also lived on the street at Dufferin and Wilson that we did, was offered some chicken land. He was offered to purchase some chicken land. And he said no, because he didn't know what he would do with a bunch of land that they grow chickens on. And that turned out to be Yorkdale Plaza. So we were in that area growing up, and I was just a blissful innocent, and I all sheltered all my life.
Oh, my God.
What, you heard that?
No, I'm saying what a loss of money.
No, don't worry about it. Jews take these things in stride. We've been taking things in stride for like 2,000 to 3,000 years, so we're pretty used to it.
And then he wanted to fly,
Well,
but
that
he
was
ended
what I'm
up
saying.
being
In
a
my-
truck driver, right? So let's,
Well, on that I don't know about the truck driver. I know that like in my region, in my area there, where Yorkdale's Chicken Land was, there was an airfield, a Lever Brothers airfield. They would manufacture airplanes, fly them, teach people how to fly, and it struck me as really, really great that when my mom told me stories, Allah Shalom, may she rest in peace, about her eldest brother, that he came into our
push
neighborhood.
back so he can go to the bathroom.
Sure. I think he wants to go. No,
Are
come
you
on
going to go
way.
this way? Go this
Go
way.
direct. Or
Too much rum in the Navy. We don't have any for you today.
well, what was romantic to me about the area we lived was that my uncle Gordon, whom I never met, used to come up to that area. And I said, wow, my uncle used to be in this area. And that's because he fell in love with machines, motors, cars, trucks, and airplanes. He was so thrilled to be to learn about how a car worked, and it wasn't you wouldn't say it's a kind of a thing that a Jewish boy would be too interested in. Many of us are very sort of sequestered in schools and learning and all that kind of thing. He was more of a hands-on person. He was very, very much into motors and cars and planes. And that's why, in fact, as horrible and as awesome and catastrophic as the war was, it was really ideal for him. Because one thing he loved and never stopped loving was airplanes and flying. It was like tailor-made for him. He grew up in a family where this was frowned upon. His brothers became a pharmacist. One became a pharmacist, one became an anesthetist, and eventually a head of a hospital. But he was the one who liked the machines and loved running them and loved flying them. So it was really, when the war started, he was very keen to enlist. And as Ellin tells me, because Ellin is a crack journalist, and she got everything out of my uncle, well, the things that they never told me, like the parents, my grandparents were against him having any kind of this involvement. I didn't know that. She tells me that because she got it out of my uncle in New York.
That's what I do.
That's what she does. She got more out of him than he ever told
Can you
me.
imagine being married to me? Anyway, okay.
Well, let me think.
No,
Yes,
so-
I can. No, that's another story.
That's another story. So then let's go where he is already in the service. He's done 91 sorties in his plane with the RAF. He's based in Alexandria. He gets a lot of furloughs because he contracts malaria, because he'd also been in North Africa, like a lot of Canadian Jewish boys that went through Italy and Africa. They got malaria, right? And they had to go to the Holy Land, to Palestine, to recuperate a few times. What happened to him there when he was in Palestine that made him do that picture that you heard of from your
Well,
family?
my mom showed me letters that he wrote about his experiences in the Holy Land, and it just turned his heart so much towards the value and the sacredness of it and the beauty of it and the heritage of it that I didn't even know that. I didn't even know, because as we were talking about, he put a Jewish star on his Spitfire, on the fuselage. When, like, other people would put, I don't know, Mae West or something like that. Was that
Yeah,
what you
Pin-Up
said?
Girls, Mae
Pin-Up
West.
Girls, Mae West.
Absolutely, from Hollywood.
He
right.
actually, I didn't know this was after he visited Israel. Is that true? There you go. I learned something right away today. He had sent home pictures which are legendary in our family, of him leaning against the propeller with the fuselage of his plane clearly showing a large Magen David, a Star of David. And he had no fears in flying this against the Germans. And he also must have had no fears about having his name registered as Hebrew on his form as well.
Sadly, unfortunately, there's no grave for him. And on his 92nd sortie, something happened. We're not sure if he was shot down or, well, we know he was shot down or he had engine trouble over the Mediterranean off of Alexandria. The plane crashed. He survived, and then the parachute got stuck in the propeller right?
No.
No? What happened?
That's not what. Well, let's put it this way. Another side of my family, my dad's side of the family, had a lot of Jews who served in the war as well, and they were also flyers. They told me a different story,
Okay.
and it's very much apropos of what Mr. Polansky said. According to cousins of mine from the Lindsay side of the family, formerly known as Lindsay, our name was changed for us by the Ord Street Public School here in Toronto. Thanks to them, we're Lindsays. We're the Jewish Lindsays. We don't wear the kilts, but we're the Jewish Lindsays. Very few. I get all kinds of entreaties from Scotland to buy a kilt in my family tartan. But no, we were made Scottish by the Ord Street Public School. At any rate, they told me they were flying and they saw the sortie and they saw what happened. He, after, I don't know, more than 90 missions, his plane had been shot up and he had parachuted out. And his chute may have been, no, I don't think he was cut up by his propeller. What they told me they saw, was that just as Mr. Polansky said, the guy who shot him down came back and strafed him while he was parachuting into the ocean.
As the Greek freighter was racing to try to save him because they saw him, and they were not, it was Themistocles, help me, Ted. I forget how to, it's the name of the Greek ship. It's a Greek freighter. The captain has a full report, and he said, I saw it. We sent a lifeboat. We came as fast as we could. Then they couldn't find his body, and then they did, and it was still attached to the parachute, and he didn't survive. They tried to revive him on the dinghy, and he didn't survive.
Just to finish the story, my cousins who were flyers claim, that's what they told me anyway, that they pursued the man that strafed my uncle, and they shot him down.
I have to change my book now. I didn't know that.
Well, it's second edition.
That's right. So we want to thank you, and we want to thank Mo for sharing the stories of your service and your family's service, your uncle's service. And now I'd like to have us return to our seats and invite Malcolm to take over for the formal part of the ceremony. Thank you.
My father was a Legionnaire in Scarborough. He did 25 years in the British Army as and finished as a band regimental sergeant major, and he was one of the 47 survivors of the Battle of Calais, of the 2,500 men who went in the Rifle Brigade, the King's Royal Rifle Brigade, and the King's Royal Rifle Corps, and the Queen's Rifles went there to hold Calais for as long as they could because of Dunkirk being evacuated, and he was one of the famous 47 that were taken off by HMS Gulzar at the very last minute. So the chances of my being here, and then my mother was in the ATS, but she was at home in Bristol and during the Blitz in Bristol, and she was a 500-kilogram Herman, they called them Herman bombs because they were very fat, landed on their street, and it wiped out all the houses on the street and all the people in them, except for the house at the very end of the street, which happened to be my mother's house, and they were hiding under the stairs, and they were the only people who survived on the street. So I'm here, it's awfully lucky. I have learned so much about the Legion this week that I have not known from conversations with P.J. O'Neill, who's the president of the Royal Canadian Legion. And one of the things that I learned about the Legion is the work that they're now doing when they're moving along. And we would like to have two people come up, please, and to both make remarks. P.J. O'Neill, who is the Todmorden branch president, and Shelley Rosen, who is the Wingate branch president. So if they both come forward, please, for a few remarks. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Do I need the microphone? Oh, ouch.
Very briefly, what Malcolm is talking about, back in the day, shell shock. If you've been to Vimy, you'll understand. Battle fatigue. And now we've come up, we understand it's PTSD. It is everywhere in our lives. The Legion has taken it upon themselves to say, hey, enough of this, we must educate the population. And to that end, the Legion will survive and will educate not only this generation, but the generations to come. So that is our purpose, reaching out to the community as well as the veteran community. And that's what we are striving to accomplish.
Malcolm, thank you. Ellin, thank you for all your work. I know you've worked very hard this past week, given the challenges, the uncertainty for the venue and juggling your busy schedule. Thank you, Comrade O'Neill, for hosting us today. General Wingate has been in operation for over 84 years. In the mid-40s, the Jewish Brigade, as it was known, officially became the General Wingate branch to honor Major General Ord Charles Wingate, DSO, a non-Jew and distinguished British Army officer and ardent Zionist. Our small branch has 72 members currently, about half of whom are veterans of the Second World War. One of the most important activities is the annual Poppy campaign taking place right now. Over the years, our small group of dedicated volunteers have managed to raise over $1 million to assist the veterans in need of support in the Toronto area. Thank you again for hosting us today.
Sergeant at Arms, present the colors. We ask everybody please to rise for the last post. center, Lindsay, please. Sir.
The memorial prayer I'm going to be doing right now is a prayer beseeching the Almighty to elevate and bless and keep the souls that we're trying to memorialize. In this case, we're going to be doing it for a group of people, but even though it's a Jewish prayer, thank you, even though it's a Jewish prayer, we have to understand that in the Jewish religion, we often pray for everyone else as well. And so this prayer called Kel Malei Rachamim, God who is full of mercy, asks God to take care of all of the souls who gave their lives in defense of Canada. I'm going to, when we do this in the Miles Nadal Center, people always ask us to interpret, translate it for them. So I'm going to read it, the translation first of what this prayer is. And as I say, it is a Jewish prayer, but it's for everyone. Almighty God, full of compassion, who dwells in the higher realms, grant fitting and proper rest upon the wings of the divine in the holy and pure heights, which shine like the splendor of the firmament, to the souls of the members of the Armed Forces of Canada who left their families and their homes to fight on land, air, and sea, and died as heroes defending their nation. Because we pray today that their souls be remembered, may their rest be in paradise, and so may the Master of Mercies shelter them under the cover of his wings forever, and bind their souls to eternal life. God himself is their reward, and may they repose in peace in their places of rest. And let us say, Amen. El Malei Rachamim, shochen b'mromim, hamitzei menucha nechona kanfei Ashkenaz, במחלות כנושים ותחולים כזוכר הרקיע מסירים את נשמות חיילי צבא של קנדה שעזבו משפחתם ובתיהם ויעלו להילחם ביבשה, באוויר ובים, ונפלו מות גיבורים בהגנת מדינתם. בחמור שאנחנו מתפללים בעד הזכרת נשמותיהם מגן עדן תהי מנוחתם לכן בעל הרחמים יסירם בצדק כנפיו לעולמים ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם אדוני הוא נחלתם וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם ונאמר אמן.
The Act of Remembrance is actually a three-stanza poem. The part of the Act of Remembrance that you hear at the right at the end of Rouse is just a very little part of it. And what we wanted to do today was to share one of the stanzas with you of the full poem. so that you could have an idea of where it comes from. And here is from our school, Shell Risley.
Hey, I can adjust the microphone. It's a pleasure and it's a blessing to be here with everybody. We're adding this second stanza. I thought it would be a good idea to add the second stanza because it reflects the vibrance and the determination and the power and the strength of our fighting women and men as they went to battle. They went with songs to the battle. They were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, together, we shall remember them.
One of the things that has unfortunately over the years, because it's been read unfortunately by so many vice principals in schools, is in not a very dramatic way or without the feeling that the poem really needs, is in Flanders Fields. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. John McCrae actually was a medical officer and a gunner when he first joined up in the First World War. On May the 2nd, 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, and Ypres was a salient, if you will, a bulge in the German lines that was fought over during the entire war. John McCrae's best friend was killed. And on May the 3rd of 1915, he had to bury his close friend, Lieutenant Alexis Helmer. And after it was over, John McCrae sat on the back of an ambulance, and he wrote down this poem because he was upset, and he threw it away. And some of his fellow members, some of his friends came and they picked it back up again. And they sent it off to Punch magazine, which was a very world-famous magazine at the time. And Punch magazine published it later that year. And over the years, it has become the one poem that most signifies what occurred during the First World War. I beg your pardon. I remember, too, that this poem was written at the beginning, really at the beginning of the conflict, and there were still so many more years of conflict to go. I learned from P.J. O'Neill this week that one of the reasons why poppies grew on the battlefield was that they loved turned over soil. And because of the loamy soil that they had in Belgium, in the north of Europe, they grew so very well. So what McCrae noticed was that all of the freshly done graves had poppies growing in them because the poppies just grew so well in that soil. And what this poem asks of everyone is to not allow their deaths to be for naught, to have their deaths mean something. And I think it's something that still today, rings true in our ongoing fight for peace and for freedom. Those words still ring. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. John McCrae, who was exhausted by 1918 and had become a doctor full-time in Boulogne, died. never saw the end of the war. He died of pneumonia and cerebral meningitis on January the 28th, 1918, but his poem stays with us forever. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you please join me in the singing of God Save the Queen. God save our gracious Queen, long live our noble Queen. God save our Queen. Send her victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save our Queen. Sergeant at Arms. I'd like to finish today by thanking our distinguished veterans. Thomas Snedden, Royal Navy, who served on the destroyer HMCS Wanderer in the Mediterranean and the Southeast Asia Command during World War II. Thank you, sir. Freddie Mintz, who is from the Korean War, who served in the Royal Canadian Air Force on ground crew. Thank you, sir. And Morris Polansky, Royal Canadian Army Service Corps, attached to the 5th Armored Division, fought in Italy and then fought in Northwest Europe. And as a final note, it's one of those strange coincidences of the world. My father-in-law, the late Bernard Zuber, father of my wife, Barbara, was also in the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps, attached to 5th Armored Division, and was in that convoy that went to Italy from Liverpool. And it's just one of those wonderful things. Thank you to P.J. O'Neill and all of his staff here at Todmorden Legion. We could not have done this without you. There's a little bit of nosh and coffee and tea next door if you'd like. And if we would ask, please allow our distinguished guests to go into the room over here, which is the Past President's Lounge. I'd very appreciate it. Thank you very much, and that closes these ceremonies.